I think that it is fair to say that they're under the umbrella of suspicion.
If you can't take them to trial because you don't have enough evidence, then be quiet. That's your job.
If you can't take them to trial, be quiet. Okay. In the last few episodes, we've stumbled across some pretty interesting insights from some folk that are sort of on the periphery of this case. The gardener, Brian Scott, the photographer, Judith Phillips. Remember, Scott revealed how JonBenet seemed to be missing her father. Just talking about that brought her to tears. While the photographer claimed Burke had a temper, and she suggested that JonBenet had been deliberately hit with a golf club, a claim all three Ramseys, Patsy who saw it, John who wasn't there, and Burke who was, all deny. Now we'll try to get to know another peripheral character, Dr. Beuf.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't feel. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. Now, the first time we encounter Dr. Beuf is in Linda Arndt's report, and he's actually there on the very first day. She writes, I asked to speak with Patsy Ramsey. I was told by doctor, and that part's scratched out, but it is Dr. Beuf, that Patsy Ramsey was too medicated to talk to anyone. Dr. Beuf had given Patsy Valium. So, in a weird way, Dr. Beuf has a way of actually interfering with the investigation, interrupting the investigation, because the doctor is treating Patsy in the way that he is. Now remember, Dr. Beuf was at the Fernie home when Linda Arndt arrived on the day after Christmas. Haven't you ever thought that that's kind of strange? Sergeant Mason and Linda Arndt arrive at the house to interview John and Patsy, and they say, you know, can we do this on Saturday morning, December 28th? And guess who kind of runs interference? Guess who basically says, no, we can't do that? Dr. Beuf. Dr. Beuf tells Sergeant Mason he doesn't know if Patsy is going to be available for an interview at that time. Dr. Beuf says that Patsy's in a fragile emotional state and that he doesn't want to subject her to anything which would further upset her. So it's really thanks to Dr. Beuf medicating Patsy that night and dealing with the officers that night as well, that the Ramseys were found to be not fit to be questioned right then. And then the whole situation got drawn out even further. You know, the situation continued for several days afterward. But have you thought about this? Why was a child's doctor at the Fernie home and not Patsy's doctor? And it wasn't just Dr. Beuf that was at the Fernie home providing support to the Ramseys, but his wife as well. What is going on? Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. By the way, I made a little error in the previous analysis where I said Dr. Cyril Wecht was sued for 150 million. I didn't really notice anyone finding fault with that statement. It was actually Dr. Werner Spitz. Details are important. It's important to notice little errors, right? Then I also want to draw your attention to the 130th review for Christmas Star left by Chris. He writes, a gripping story. It was actually left earlier today, February 12th. He writes, this book was a fast read. It gave me insight into the Ramsey home. I really want to figure out what happened to this poor little girl. Thanks, Chris, for your review. Then there's also a review left recently from Loretta Drescher in Canada, who writes, informative and descriptive with a style of writing I enjoyed reading, a page-turner that left me wanting to know more. Highly recommended for true crime sleuths. Then also D.A. Reid from the United Kingdom, amazing book, well written, with great insights. And then there's also this review from Germany, left in January, from Lever. This book made me think and gave me a whole new perspective on this case. If you're interested in buying Christmas Star, I'll leave a link to it in the description. If you find this analysis worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. So a moment ago I mentioned that it wasn't just Dr. Beuf that was at the Fernies providing support to the Ramseys, but also his wife. What's going on with that? Let's go to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Arndt was paged, and she was the last person to leave the Ramsey house. This is the night of the 26th of December. At midnight that night, Dr. Beuf and his wife Penny, and I think it should be Penni, they were still at the Fernie's house. This is at midnight, right? Along with Patsy's friend Patty Novak, who had become an unofficial nurse. Patsy had to be helped even in the bathroom. Finally, the Valium she had taken, and that was the Valium given to her by Dr. Beuf, made Patsy drowsy. She fell asleep again on the living room floor. That's quite interesting that she ends up sleeping on the floor. 2 hours later, she was awake again, sobbing, asking for Burke, asking if all the doors and windows were locked. So quite a dramatic night following the dramatic events earlier that day. Now, in this analysis, we're going to try to get to know the good doctor a lot better. First via the broad strokes and then via a narrower focus.
Worth playing for?
Yeah.
All right, so Dr. Beuf died 8 years ago on May 11th, 2017. That was 9 years after Patsy died. He was 84 years old. He died 2 days before his 85th birthday. What else do we know? Well, we know that he was raised on his family's farm, a ranch in Wyoming. He received a degree in mechanical engineering, so he was also not from Boulder. He worked for a year at Bell Telephone Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey. He then accepted an offer by General Electric, GE's new missile and space division in Philadelphia, where he was involved in designing missiles, satellites, Mars exploration probes, and he became manager of the Space Division's international operations. Now remember, John Ramsey was a vice president for Lockheed Martin. So we can see that John Ramsey would have a lot in common with Dr. Beuf. Dr. Beuf was a former mechanical engineer. John was a former electrical engineer. Dr. Beuf, as I say, had ties to GE. Well, that's the company that Lockheed eventually sold Access Graphics to for $2.8 billion in November 1997. In 1972, Beuf took a leave of absence from GE to attend Temple University School of Medicine. He was 40 years of age when he made this pivot, and his internship and residency followed at the University of Pennsylvania's Children's Hospital. For the next 2 years, he was director of the intensive care nursery at Boerne Hospital, and he then returned to his hometown in Wyoming, where he practiced general pediatrics. Get this, he served as a chief of staff at Sheridan County Memorial Hospital and was appointed by the governor to the Wyoming Certificate of Need Board and Early Intervention Council. In 1990, this is coming into the time frame of the Ramseys, Dr. Beuf moved to Boulder, admitting patients to Boulder's community hospital. His obituary notes that in addition to his general pediatric work, Dr. Beuf loved teaching students at the Colorado University's medical school, where he was a clinical professor. So the doctor lectured at Colorado University. That's where Susan Stein was a director of planning, and her husband Glenn was a director of finance. I wonder if they knew each other. His obituary goes on to note that he was board certified in pediatrics. He was a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics. He was a member of the Colorado and Boulder County Medical Societies. He was awarded the American Medical Association's Physicians Recognition Award with commendation for self-directed learning and the Colorado University's Medical School Career Teachers Scholar Award. So he's a very respected doctor, and he was someone who also wrote articles that appeared in national journals in the fields of medicine, interplanetary exploration, and sports car magazines. So it seems like he was also a writer, had some kind of flair for language. Doc, as he was known to his family, lived life with an adventurous spirit. He owned and flew his own plane as a teenager, using a horse pasture on his family's ranch as the landing strip. As a young man, he also bicycled across Europe and climbed the Matterhorn. So Dr. Beuf comes across as the Lou Smith of pediatrics in Colorado, a legend and well-respected. So on the one hand, how could such a legend miss a beat of a child in his care? I mean, it's preposterous. On the other hand, if he did miss it, how would that look? Again, via his interest in flying and in bicycling, we can see how he had mutual interests in common with John, and why Boulder, with its elaborate bicycle networks, likely appealed to him. Then there's also a mention in his obituary of the loss of his wife, Penny, as I say, spelled Penni. And then there's also a mention of a service will be conducted at St. John's on Saturday, July 8th. We've heard that name before as well, haven't we? St. John's, which is where JonBenet's memorial service was held, and Penny spoke about being there to shield the Ramseys from the cameras.
What we agreed to was that we would come out of the front door of the church and not try to shield ourselves from being photographed.
We were wanting to protect them because they had been through so much grief already, and the congregation basically just tried to shield them from that sort of thing.
By the way, Penny was an artist, which was something Dr. Beuf's wife and John's wife, Patsy, had in common. Art, I mean. Now that we've gotten a broad introduction to the Beufs, let's dig into one of the few interviews he ever gave. It was to arch Ramsey apologist Paula Woodward, and it happened on February 14, 1997. You might remember that date from the previous video where we dealt with that story from the Boulder Daily Camera. It was the date portions of JonBenet's autopsy report became available for the first time. And so right on cue, Paula Woodward is available and Dr. Beuf is available to counter what is in the autopsy report. And so this interview is the result. On Friday evening, February 14, 1997, KUSA TV aired an interview with Dr. Beuf. The anchor, which was, I think, Paula Woodward, said, JonBenet Ramsey's pediatrician, that's Dr. Beuf, says he's convinced that she was not SA'd. Wow, and yet at the same time, the Denver Post was reporting the exact opposite. Autopsy shows SA, and that was published one day later. I guess this is the medical equivalent of the intruder theory versus the Ramseys did it theory. Anyway, it goes on to note, and he says, meaning Dr. Beuf, told Boulder police investigators exactly that when they asked him, that he didn't believe that SA occurred. He also said he would only talk with one media person, and that person was Paula Woodward. And so Woodward says to him, he said he wants the information he has as JonBenet's pediatrician out in the public, but he's appalled by media coverage, and he will talk once only. And, the I only want to talk to Paula Woodward part is also interesting, isn't it? He says it's because the media is biased, but he's chosen a reporter who even today appears side by side with John Ramsey at CrimeCon. Isn't that a bias that's in favor of the Ramseys? And if so, is that the sort of bias Beuf was after? Because rightly or wrongly, that's not neutral. Dr. Francesco Beuf says he saw JonBenet 30 times in 3 years. He said that the last time he saw her was 5 weeks before she died. Woodward, when you talked to the police, did they ask you about SA of JonBenet? Beuf, yes, of course they did. Woodward, what did you tell them? Beuf, I told them absolutely, categorically no. There was absolutely no evidence, either physical or historical. Woodward, and that's from seeing her 30 times in 3 years. Beuf, about that. Now, it's interesting that Beuf talks about seeing JonBenet an awful lot, 30 times, and he feels he can say absolutely, categorically, with complete certainty that there was no evidence whatsoever. And he even adds to that, not even any evidence of physical abuse. But how can he be 100% certain when he wasn't the treating doctor, for example, in Charlevoix, in terms of that incident with a golf club in Charlevoix? Bear in mind, Judith Phillips tells the opposite story here, where she says that something happened to JonBenet that was apparently deliberate, not an accident, and that at least opens the door to the possibility that there was some historical incident after all. It's also interesting that in the middle of mentioning JonBenet's 30 visits to him, which Woodward seems to emphasize as meaning, you saw her quite a lot then, well, neither the doctor nor the reporter seem to acknowledge what I think is fairly obvious, that the number of times JonBenet was sick doesn't appear to be normal. And so what do you think? Do you think 30 visits in 3 years is normal? I mean, is that part of being a perfect doctor, perfect town, and a perfect patient? Now, elsewhere in the interview, Dr. Beuf does talk about her mother was off being treated for cancer. He does mention that, and he also mentions that he thought that he heard it mentioned a couple of times, the beauty pageants. Now, as far as I'm concerned, he seems to minimize both Patsy's cancer and JonBenet's pageants, whereas I feel like both of those had a massive impact on the family, on JonBenet, on Patsy herself. And so JonBenet's pageants, are they completely irrelevant to her death? Oh, so any sexual motive or sexual activity is completely irrelevant to her death as well. Oh, so the sexualizing of a child had no relevance to this young child being attacked and killed the way that she was, because I think the pageants did have a huge impact on someone. I do think someone was influenced in some way by her appearance, her behavior, her performances compared to other children. Woodward also asked the good doctor what JonBenet said to him, during those 30 visits. But the good doctor, who is so absolutely certain about some things, he can't seem to remember a single thing JonBenet said to him. He just seems to remember feelings. And in this regard, let's go through this part of the transcript. Woodward, tell me what she said to you, meaning what did JonBenet say to you? Beuf, to be honest with you, I can't remember. I just remember it made me feel good to see that much happiness and niceness in one spot. Woodward, 30 visits in 3 years. He said, meaning Dr. Beuf said, her parents were good about getting her in and it wasn't an abnormal amount of visits. And then the question again reiterated, do you think JonBenet was essayed? Beuf, I do not think she was essayed. I'm convinced she was not essayed. Woodward, Dr. Beuf also treats JonBenet's 10-year-old brother Burke. He describes him as a neat kid. And so in this postscript to her interview, Dr. Beuf also mentions he treats Burke. He describes Burke, as you've seen here, as a neat kid. Isn't he missing something here? Or am I?
These were little girls that were on a little stage performing in front of parents and grandparents that happened to be videotaped by the people putting on the pageants.
Sunburst is beginning its 19th year.
Well, and I also think by family members, right? Family members also videotaping the pageants. And besides the parents and the grandparents, we also know that Burke attended these pageants. We heard that recently on Dr. Phil. I'm not going to take it further than that, but in the next episode, we will dig a little bit deeper into the finer details, and this is a little foretaste of what's to come.
She was here 3 times for annual well checks, 1 time for a stomachache, 1 time for vaginitis, 1 time for a bruised nose from a fall at a local market, and 21 times for cold, sinusitis, ear infections, bronchitis, pneumonia, hay fever, possible asthma.
What more than that?
Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.